Welcome back, brave souls, to Nakora Nights. Tonight, we're heading into one of the strangest, most unpredictable places in America, Oregon, a land of fog-soaked forests, endless coastlines, silent logging roads, and things people swear they can't explain. You think you know Oregon? Wait until you hear what locals refuse to talk about. These are 10 true Oregon horror stories. Real encounters pulled from deep woods, forgotten roads, and small towns that seem normal during the day, but turn unrecognizable at night. A hiker who followed footprints that suddenly stopped mid-trail. A coastal storm that carried voices in the wind. And a cabin in the Cascades where the lights came on by themselves, even though the power had been cut for weeks. These aren't legends. These are stories from the people who lived to tell them, and barely. Before we step into Oregon's shadows, tell me, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Because if it's late, this video might hit a little differently. If you're brave enough to journey into the fog, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment saying, "I'm still in the dark." Now, take a breath, don't look towards your window, and whatever you do, don't follow the sound you hear behind you. This is 10 Untold Most Disturbing True Oregon Horror Stories. Let's begin. I did not plan on remembering this, but it still follows me every night like a shadow that refuses to let go. My name is Devin, and before everything changed, I was just a kid trying to finish my studies and prove I could build a real life for myself. Back then, I was in my second year at a university near the Oregon coast, studying wildlife conservation because I grew up loving forests, mountains, and rivers. I always felt safe in the woods. I used to think nothing truly dangerous lived there, not anymore. I was wrong in ways I never knew a person could be wrong. I grew up in a quiet town in northern Idaho, surrounded by pine-covered hills and cold lakes that stayed blue even in winter. My father worked as a carpenter and my mother cleaned cabins for tourists, so I spent most of my time exploring the forest behind our house. I learned to tell animal tracks apart, I learned which sounds meant danger, and I learned to move through trees like they were old friends. I thought that made me brave, or maybe even lucky. It did not. It only made me confident enough to walk into things I should have stayed far away from. When I moved to Oregon for school, everything felt new and exciting. I was living on my own for the first time. I had a rusty little Toyota that my father rebuilt with his own hands. It ran fine most days, except for its strange habit of stalling when the temperature dropped. I used to laugh about it, telling friends it had personality. I am not laughing anymore. That truck might have saved me or cursed me. Some nights I still cannot decide which one it was. It happened in late October when the air carried that sharp bite of early winter. I had been talking to someone at school for a while, a guy named Milo from a tiny town near the mountains. We had been seeing each other for about 2 months. He was the kind of person who smiled with his whole face, someone who made you feel like the world was not as heavy as it sometimes seemed. His younger brother was having a birthday that weekend, and Milo wanted me to meet his family, make things more official, he said. I agreed because I liked him, and because I thought it would be a simple little trip, a small celebration, nothing more. But things do not go the way you expect when the forest decides it wants something. On the morning we were supposed to leave, Milo texted me saying he had eaten something bad at lunch and was now curled up in bed sick. He told me to go anyway, that his family already set up a room for me, that his brother would be disappointed if I backed out. I told him I could just stay, but he insisted. I wish he had not. I wish I had ignored him. But back then, I wanted people to think I kept my promises, so I grabbed my bag, grabbed my jacket, and started the drive south along the winding Oregon roads that cut through miles of forest. The sun was dipping low when I left campus, turning the sky orange like it was on fire. By the time I reached the long stretch of road leading to the mountains where Milo's family lived, the traffic had thinned out. Only a few cars passed me, and soon even those disappeared. The deeper I went, the thicker the woods became. Tall fir trees stood like dark pillars on both sides, their branches hanging heavy with the cold. Then the fog rolled in. It came fast, too fast, like it had been waiting for me. 1 minute the road was clear. The next, my headlights were swallowed whole. The fog looked alive, moving in slow, swirling patterns that reminded me of fingers brushing across the air. I slowed down to a crawl, gripping the wheel so tight my hands hurt. The radio began to flicker with static, catching pieces of stations I had never heard before. A few seconds of old country music, then a soft humming sound that made my neck prickle, then silence. I tried to shake it off, telling myself fog was normal here, that the radio glitching was normal, that being alone was normal. But nothing about the air felt normal. It felt cold in a way that was not just temperature, like it was sinking into my bones. About 20 minutes into this slow, painful drive, my truck started sputtering. At first it was just a little cough from the engine, then another, then a long choking sound that made my heart jump into my throat. The gas tank was full, the temperature gauge looked fine, the oil light was off, nothing made sense. I whispered a small prayer under my breath, hoping the truck would keep going just long enough to reach the next town. I knew the highway would split soon, and that taking the newer route would be safer and faster. But when the junction appeared through the fog, I missed it. I could swear the sign had been pointing the wrong way, like someone turned it. Or maybe I was just tired and anxious and seeing things. Either way, I ended up on an old loop road that cut through deeper parts of the forest. I felt the temperature drop the moment I turned onto it. Not a normal drop, not a cold wind. This was sharp and sudden, like stepping into a freezer. I reached for the heater, but it was already blasting hot air. My breath fogged the inside of the windshield anyway. Then the smell hit me. It was faint at first, just a tiny hint of something spoiled mixed with wet leaves. But with every yard I drove deeper, it grew stronger and stronger until it felt like the entire cab was stuffed with rotting meat. I rolled up the windows, but nothing changed. It felt like the smell wasn't coming from outside at all. It felt like it was rising from somewhere under my seat. I wanted to turn around. I should have, but the fog was so thick behind me that I couldn't even see the road anymore. I kept going forward because it felt like the only choice I had. Then my truck died. The engine let out a sad sigh and shut off completely. The headlights flickered twice, dimmed, and then darkness swallowed everything. For a second I just sat there, shaking so hard I could hear my teeth clicking. The forest was silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. They were behind the truck, close enough that I could feel vibrations in the metal frame. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But no deer walks on 2 feet, and no bear drags something across the ground the way I heard it dragging. The footsteps came closer until they stopped right at the tailgate. My breath caught in my throat. Then the truck shook, not from wind, not from settling metal. It rocked as if something put its weight on the back end. I turned in my seat, pressing my face to the rear window. At first I saw nothing but fog. Then a shape slowly appeared through the gray. It was tall, taller than any person I had ever seen. Wrapped in strips of dirty cloth from head to toe, the bandages soaked in dark stains that looked almost black under the dim light of the dying headlights. The thing did not move. It just stood there in the bed of my truck, its head tilted in a way that made my skin crawl, like it was listening for something inside me. I reached for the key with shaking hands. When I turned it, nothing happened. I tried again. Click, click, click. Then suddenly the engine roared back to life, loud and rough, like something had forced it awake. I slammed the truck into drive and floored the pedal. The truck leapt forward, and I heard a heavy thud behind me, like something dropped or jumped off. I did not care. I did not look. I drove like the world was ending, and the only safe place was somewhere far ahead. But the fog stayed around me like a wall. It refused to break. It refused to let me go. While I was still trying to catch my breath, I remembered one of the strange horror tales I had read for fun a few days earlier. A hiker had been deep in the forest near Mount Hood and claimed he found a lonely tent zipped shut with a phone ringing inside, yet the snow around it had no footprints at all. I had laughed at the story then. I was not laughing now. The image stuck in my head so hard that I kept imagining that tent somewhere close, hidden in the fog, waiting for me, calling my name across the woods. The fog stayed thick until the road curved sharply, and just when I thought I was about to crash into a tree, the air cleared a little. I could see a sliver of the night sky. I could see the edge of a distant mountain, and I could see movement on the side of the road. Someone kneeling near a puddle of rainwater. At first, I thought it was a person who needed help, maybe a hiker or someone who got lost. But as I drove closer, I heard something that made every muscle in my body tighten. The person was whispering names. Not random names. Names I recognized from news stories. Names of people who had gone missing in Oregon over the last decade. I saw their faces in my memory, the posters, the articles, the unsolved cases. It felt like cold hands were squeezing my chest from the inside. I did not slow down. I pressed the gas harder, but the kneeling figure lifted its head and I saw its face in the mirror. It was pale, hollow, stretched in ways no face should stretch. The fog swallowed it again as I sped past, but the whispering followed me, faint and echoing, as if the names clung to the air. I pressed on. The road cut deeper through the forest, and I told myself just a few more miles and I would reach the next town. I kept repeating it over and over until my voice sounded like someone else's. Then the smell came back, worse this time. So strong I gagged. My heater blew warm air, but the smell still filled the truck. It smelled like skin peeling away, like something dead being carried too long. And then the truck shuddered. Not breaking down, not stalling. It shook like someone grabbed the back of it and wouldn't let go. I looked in the mirror. At first I saw only fog swirling behind me. Then I saw fingers. Long, pale fingers sliding out of the fog and stretching across the tailgate. Then another hand. Then a shape too tall to be human pulling itself toward me, the bandages trailing behind it like wet leaves. I screamed without making a sound. I slammed the gas pedal down so hard the engine groaned. The truck shot forward faster than I had ever driven it. The road blurred under the wheels. The thing clung to the back until the truck hit a bump and the entire frame lurched violently. I heard a loud slam and then silence. I did not stop. Not even when the fog finally broke and I saw the lights of a small town glowing faintly ahead. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, shaking so hard I could barely open the door. The night was cold, but nothing compared to what I had felt on that loop road. I walked to the back of my truck, even though every part of my body screamed at me not to. I saw the handprints first. Not normal handprints. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow, as if someone had stretched them too far. Brownish red stains clung to the edges of the prints like dried blood. In the corner of the truck bed I saw a torn strip of cloth tangled in the metal. It was soaked in dark stains and smelled exactly like the thing I had fled from. That smell stayed with me for weeks. I did not go to Milo's house. I drove straight back home, locked my dorm door, and sat awake until the sun came up. I did not tell anyone. I could not. Who would believe me? But the horror did not end there. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of something brushing against my window. I sat up slowly, holding my breath. I thought maybe it was just a tree branch moving in the wind. Then I remembered there were no trees close enough to reach my window. Something tapped lightly against the glass. I forced myself to look. Nothing was there, just the dark. Then I heard a soft sound at my door, a slow dragging whisper against the floor. And then something began to unzip my backpack, the zipper moving tooth by tooth. I stared, frozen, as the backpack flap opened on its own. And nothing was inside, nothing except the smell. That same rotting smell that had followed me from the forest. I threw the stained cloth away the next day. I thought maybe that would stop the smell, but it didn't. Some nights, when the air is cold and the room feels too quiet, I still catch a faint whiff of it drifting across my bed. My roommate moved out halfway through the semester because she said she kept hearing someone breathing in the corner at night. She said she heard footsteps near my bed. Slow ones, dragging ones. Months later, I transferred to a school in Nevada. I told everyone it was because they had a better wildlife program. That was a lie. I just could not live anywhere near Oregon anymore. Every time fog creeps across the road when I am driving, I grip the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turn white. I keep checking the mirror. I keep expecting to see long fingers stretching across the glass. I do not know what lives in those forests. I do not want to, but I do know it is not alone. It watches, it waits, and it remembers anyone who survives. Last winter, when I was camping with friends in Idaho, I woke up before dawn to the sound of someone unzipping my tent from the outside. I froze, unable to breathe. The zipper opened halfway, then stopped. I waited for a face to appear, or a hand, or a whisper, but there was nothing. No footprints in the fresh snow, no sign of anyone. Just the quiet sound of the zipper swaying gently in the cold air. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I see other things too. A lonely tent deep in the Mount Hood forest with a phone ringing inside. A person kneeling at the edge of Crater Lake whispering names that belong to the missing. A pale hand reaching out from a place where the fog never lifts. A bandaged shape crawling closer no matter how fast I run. I wish I could forget. I wish the forest would let me. But if we ever drive through Oregon at night, especially when the fog is thick and the road feels too quiet, do not stop. Do not take the old roads. Do not look into the mirror for too long, and never trust someone whispering in the dark. Not everything that walks toward you is human. Not everything that stares at you wants help. Some things want you to follow them into the trees. Some things want you to kneel at the water with them. Some things want to unzip your tent while you sleep. And some things, wrapped in rotting bandages and old memories, want you more than you ever want to know. My name is Jonah. I was 32 when everything changed, and before that night, I thought I had my life figured out. I worked as a freelance cartographer for environmental surveys around Oregon. My job was to map places most people never cared to see, drainage networks, forgotten logging roads, and sealed access tunnels left behind by long-dead industries. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I loved the quiet. I always believed that silence could keep me sane. I know now that silence is not always empty. Sometimes, it's waiting. That winter, I took a private job from a local developer who wanted to expand a series of hiking trails near the old mining settlement of Crescent Hollow, deep in the Cascades. The place had a strange reputation. Hikers went missing there, and sometimes, campers claimed to hear cries echoing through the canyons at night. I didn't think much of it then. Oregon is filled with ghost stories. Every stretch of forest has one, but Crescent Hollow was different. It was built over something ancient, something the forest had been trying to bury for a long time. I arrived in late November, just before the snow line crept down. The town itself was nearly abandoned. Only a gas station, a diner, and a few scattered homes that leaned against the cold like they were tired of standing. I rented a room above the diner and started mapping early every morning. The first week went smooth enough. I hiked through moss-choked trails and traced the outlines of half-collapsed shafts. But near the end of the second week, I found a sealed hatch hidden behind a slope of fir roots near the Rogue River. The metal was old, rusted through, and the hinges were bolted shut with iron pegs. A small sign above it had faded nearly blank, but I could still make out the letters, Survey Access. Closed, 1949. I marked the coordinates in my notebook and kept moving, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. When I returned that night, the diner's owner, a woman named Mara, noticed the mud on my boots and asked where I'd been wandering. I mentioned the hatch. Her face changed in a subtle way. Something tightened around her eyes, like she just remembered something she didn't want to think about. She told me that her grandfather used to work the tunnels during the mining boom, before they flooded. She said the county sealed them after a cave-in took an entire crew. Their bodies were never recovered. Then she added softly that the river never stopped giving things back. Boots, helmets, sometimes bones. That should have been enough to keep me away. But I've never been good at ignoring the itch of curiosity. I went back 3 nights later, after sunset, when the forest had gone still. I carried a headlamp, a spare light, and my mapping gear. I also brought a small crowbar, thinking I might loosen the bolts. It took me nearly an hour, but I managed to pry the hatch open just enough to slip through. The air that came out of that hole was heavy, humid, and wrong. It smelled like the inside of a drowned cellar. Still, I went in. The ladder dropped about 20 feet into a narrow shaft lined with concrete. When my boots touched the bottom, the beam of my light revealed a tunnel leading north, half collapsed but walkable. The walls dripped with moisture, and the floor was a patchwork of silt and shallow puddles. Every step made a sound that echoed far longer than it should have. I told myself it was just the acoustics, but even then I felt like the air was listening. About 40 feet in, I found something that made my stomach turn. The walls were covered with carvings, small vertical scratches grouped together in clusters, tally marks. Some old, some fresh. I counted at least 50 groups before I stopped. As I walked farther, I noticed the marks increased exactly with every few steps I took. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. But after 50 more paces, there were 50 new scratches. When I reached the next bend, I counted again. The tallies matched the number of steps I had taken since entering the tunnel. Someone, or something, had been keeping count. I forced myself deeper, trying to focus on my map instead of the growing dread that crawled under my skin. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, circular, with rusted rail tracks curving through the center. This must have been a loading area once. I took a few photos, though my hands were shaking enough that the images blurred. In the corner of the chamber, I noticed something glinting in the light. I walked closer and found an old mining helmet half submerged in the silt. It was still damp, as if someone had dropped it there minutes ago. Then I heard it, a soft splash behind me. I turned my light and saw a figure standing at the mouth of the tunnel. A woman. She was barefoot, her hair slicked against her skin, dripping water onto the mud. Her clothes clung to her like she'd just climbed out of the river. Her face was pale, her eyes dark. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. She didn't move toward me, just stared, and for a moment I thought she was asking for help. Then I realized her lips weren't moving at all. The sound I was hearing wasn't her. It was whispering, dozens of voices coming from the walls. I took a step back, my light trembling in my hand. The woman tilted her head slightly, then turned and began walking back toward the tunnel. Her feet made no sound, and when I glanced down, I saw that she left no footprints in the wet earth. My breath came fast, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. I called out something, maybe a plea, maybe her name if she had one, but she didn't turn around. She just melted into the darkness like smoke. I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave without knowing where she'd come from. I followed her into another passage, narrower and colder. Water trickled down the walls, and the ceiling hung low enough that I had to crouch. The deeper I went, the stronger the whispers became, overlapping, urgent. They spoke in tones I couldn't understand, broken words, pleading, fragments of prayers. The air felt thicker now, hard to breathe, like something unseen was pressing against me. After a few hundred feet, I came to another chamber. It was filled with old mining carts, all overturned and rusted, their wheels locked in place by silt. I took another step and heard the faint click of metal. I looked down. Embedded into the wall beside me were small motion-activated wildlife cameras, at least 4 of them, all pointed directly toward where I stood. They blinked one by one, red lights flickering to life. My skin crawled. Who had set them up here? And why were they aimed at this spot? The cameras began to hum softly, and I felt the weight of the air shift again. The whispers faded into silence. I thought for a second that it was over, that maybe I was alone again. Then every light went out at once. My headlamp flickered and died, and I was swallowed by absolute blackness. I could hear something moving in the dark, soft steps circling me, too many to count. I turned slowly, trying to reach for my backup light, but a hand touched my shoulder, cold. Wet. Real. I dropped to the floor and scrambled backward. When the light flicked back on, there was nothing there. Only footprints, bare, wet, circling the spot where I'd stood. I stumbled toward the tunnel, running as fast as I could. My breathing echoed, harsh and ragged. Behind me, the whispers rose again, louder, furious, blending into something almost like screams. I didn't look back. I ran until my knees buckled and my hands hit the ladder. I climbed until my palms bled and burst out into the freezing night air. The forest was silent. The river below glimmered under the moonlight. I slammed the hatch shut and staggered back toward my truck, shaking, soaked in sweat though the air was near freezing. I drove until I saw lights, until I reached the diner. Mara was still awake, cleaning the counter. When she saw me, she dropped the rag she was holding. I tried to explain, but the words came out broken. She just nodded slowly, like she already knew. She told me to go upstairs and sleep, but I didn't. I lay there all night, staring at the ceiling, listening. And just before dawn, I heard it, the faintest sound of tapping on the floorboards, slow, steady, counting. I left Crescent Hollow the next morning. I told the developer the site was unstable and that mapping would be impossible. They didn't argue. I moved south a few months later, but the dreams followed. In them, I see that same woman walking out of the Rogue River, her eyes empty, her skin blue with cold. Sometimes she stops to look at me. Sometimes she whispers something I can't understand, and always, behind her, the forest is full of faces. Pale, lost, waiting. 3 years have passed now. I try to keep busy, taking small jobs and pretending that what happened was just exhaustion, or oxygen deprivation, or a trick of the mind. But last week, I went for a morning run near the edge of my new town, and I saw something that froze my blood. On the trees lining the trail were small carvings, tallies, grouped in uneven lines. I counted them out of habit. They matched my steps exactly. Every night since, I've heard the tapping again, closer each time, like something is keeping track of me, waiting for me to stop moving. I don't go near rivers anymore, and I avoid the woods after dark, but Oregon has a way of swallowing its secrets. And sometimes, when the wind shifts, I swear I can still hear the faint click of a camera in the distance, followed by whispers too quiet to be human. If you ever find yourself near Crescent Hollow, and you see marks carved into the trees, don't count them. Don't listen for the voices. And if you ever see a barefoot woman walk out of the water without leaving footprints, don't follow. She's been waiting long enough. I was 15 when I first heard her name. It was whispered like a secret during a summer storm while rain hammered against my grandmother's old farmhouse windows in Maple Hollow, Oregon. That night, she told me about the girl who had been taken under the bridge and never found peace. She said her name wasn't supposed to be spoken after dark, but she said it anyway. The name was Thelma Taylor. Years later, I learned she was right about the curse of remembering. My name is Nora Hale, and for 10 years I worked as a forensic archivist for the Oregon State Bureau of Investigation. Most of my days were buried in digital folders and old negatives, restoring photographs from cold cases long forgotten. It wasn't the kind of job that drew glory or even attention. But it suited me, the silence and dust of the archive, the way old stories breathe through evidence left behind by people who no longer existed. That's how I found her again, Thelma Taylor. A file so old the ink had almost vanished. The record said she was 17 when she was murdered near Cathedral Park, Portland, in 1949. Her killer, Morris Leland, had confessed and was executed. But even as I scanned the brittle papers into the digital system, something felt off. I'd seen hundreds of confessions. This one didn't read right. His tone was too calm, too rehearsed, too convenient. One afternoon, I decided to drive to the site. Not because I believed in ghosts. I didn't. At least, not then. It was early October when I arrived, just before the fog rolled in from the Willamette River. Cathedral Park was silent under the shadow of the bridge's green steel ribs, gothic and eternal. The towers looked like fingers reaching toward the clouds. Beneath them, the air was colder, heavier, almost wet with something unseen. I walked along the pathways, my camera in hand, snapping shots of the bridge's structure. I was documenting for reference, I told myself, but that was a lie. I wanted to feel something. At first, all I heard was the soft creak of the bridge and the shuffle of leaves. Then came the footsteps. They were quick, sharp, like someone running in heels. The sound circled me, close but unseen. I spun, flashlight in hand, scanning the fog. Nothing. My breath came out shaky. It was too quiet after that, like the park itself was holding its breath. Then I heard her. The voice came from under the far arch, soft, trembling, and young. "Help me!" I froze. The voice wasn't muffled by distance. It was layered, like it came from two places at once, close but buried under time. I followed it, my flashlight trembling over the damp grass. Near the concrete column, I saw her. A girl, no older than 17, stood by the river's edge. Her dress looked soaked and torn, a pale blue thing stuck to her thin frame. Her hair was curled like old photographs, and her skin shimmered faintly in the light. She was mouthing words, desperate, pleading, but I couldn't hear them. My instinct screamed to run. Instead, I raised my camera. The flash went off, painting the night white. When the light faded, she was gone. I checked the photo immediately. The frame showed only fog and steel, but at the bottom corner, a faint carving etched into the concrete, TTT. She never left. I crouched, tracing the letters with my fingers. The grooves were too clean, too new. My flashlight flickered, and I caught something moving behind me in the reflection of the lens, just a blur, like fabric swaying. I turned, and there she was again. This time, her face was clearer. The bruises along her jaw, the deep red stains across her chest. Her eyes were hollow, filled with rage and sorrow that didn't belong to the living. "He lied," she said, her voice sudden and sharp. "I didn't go with him. He took me. I was waiting for the bus." My throat tightened. I couldn't breathe. "What do you want from me? Tell the truth," she said. Then she stepped back into the fog, fading until there was only her voice. He wasn't alone. For nights afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in my apartment sounded like her footsteps on the path. Every hum from the streetlights whispered the same phrase, "Tell the truth." I went back to the Bureau's records. Her case was marked closed, but buried in microfilm, I found something odd. Two other girls, Sarah Chen and Margaret Williams, had disappeared around the same time, both found near the river. Both ruled accidental deaths. Sarah Chen had drowned, though the coroner noted a skull fracture. Margaret had died of exposure, but her wrists bore marks of restraint. Neither was connected to Leland. Until I did. I brought my findings to my supervisor. He smiled politely, said it was interesting but irrelevant. The state didn't reopen 70-year-old cases because of gut feelings, and I couldn't exactly tell him a ghost had given me the names. So I kept digging. That's how I found the hunter. An old article in the Tillamook County Gazette mentioned a man named Wesley Grant who vanished while hunting in the Wilson Forest in 1952. The report said he told his wife he heard someone calling his name deep in the woods in his mother's voice. He followed it and never came back. The pattern felt the same. Someone lured away, no witness, only echoes left behind. The next weekend, I drove to Wilson Forest myself. The road was narrow, cutting through trees so dense the sunlight looked like thin ribbons. I parked near an old ranger station, loaded my camera and recorder, and started down the trail. It was silent except for my boots on wet earth and the occasional rustle in the canopy. By evening, the forest began to change. Shadows leaned long and strange. Somewhere far off, I heard laughter, childlike but broken, like someone mimicking joy without understanding it. I camped near an old clearing, just big enough for a single tent. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of rustling outside. At first, I thought it was an animal. But when I unzipped the tent, I found hand-drawn maps pinned to nearby trees. They were crude sketches of the clearing, my clearing, with a small X marking the spot where my tent stood. The ink looked wet. I felt something move behind me then, a breath against my neck. I spun, flashlight ready, but the trees were empty. I grabbed the maps, stuffed them into my bag, and sat inside the tent until dawn, clutching the camera. The next morning, I hiked back fast, but when I reached my car, my food bag was shredded open. Not by claws, by fingernails. Long, deep grooves in the canvas. Someone or something had been close enough to touch everything I owned. That night, I returned home shaking. I scanned the photos I'd taken in the forest. One image stopped me cold. Behind a row of trees, faint and blurred, was the figure of a woman in an old-fashioned dress. The same one I'd seen under the bridge, Thelma. Only now, she wasn't alone. Two shapes stood behind her, dim but human, one with long hair falling over her face, the other with her hands clasped to her chest. Sarah Chen and Margaret Williams. I could feel it. For the next few weeks, I dug deeper into the Leland case. I found that before his arrest, he worked part-time at a mill that used to ship lumber through the Wilson River logging trails, the same area where the hunter vanished. He had connections there, places where screams could vanish into the trees. And he wasn't the only one. Old records mention another worker who'd disappeared around that time, a man named Thomas Hargrove, never questioned, never found. His personnel file was stamped, transferred to Site B. But there was no Site B. Late one evening, I returned to Cathedral Park. I needed proof, something tangible. The fog was thick that night, rolling low and gray. My flashlight barely cut through it. Near the same column where I'd first seen her, the concrete now bore a new carving, "Tell them about the forest." I whispered her name, and for the first time, she answered before I finished it. Behind me, footsteps. Slow, heavy. The air turned cold, sharp enough to sting my lungs. I turned, expecting her. But the figure that stepped out of the fog was a man. He wore a tattered coat, his face shadowed under a wide hat. I couldn't see his eyes, only the faint glint of something metallic in his hand, a blade, curved and rusted. He took one step closer. Thelma appeared behind him, her face twisted in rage, her voice cut through the night like broken glass. "You will not take another." The man's body convulsed, jerking backward like something invisible had gripped him. The fog swirled around them, thick and violent, until both shapes dissolved into it. When it cleared, the only thing left was silence and a small piece of rusted metal on the ground. It was the broken end of a knife. The next morning, I turned it in as evidence. I said I found it near the riverbank during a personal photography project. 2 weeks later, a forensics contact called me privately. The blade matched a weapon logged in the 1949 Leland case, but the original was supposed to have been destroyed. He asked me how I'd really found it. I told him he didn't want to know. After that, things got worse. I started waking at 2:17 a.m. Every night, hearing whispers near my window. Sometimes they called my name, sometimes they just cried softly until dawn. Once, when I turned on my camera in the dark, the lens caught the faint outline of wet footprints leading from the window to my bed. Then one morning, a package arrived at my office. No return address. Inside were 3 photographs, mine, the ones from the forest. Only now, each photo had red pen marks circling the figures in the background. And on the back of the last photo, someone had written, "You listened, now help them rest." That night, I drove back to Wilson Forest one last time. The air was thick with rain. My headlights barely touched the road. I parked where the pavement turned to dirt and walked the rest of the way. The forest greeted me with silence, not peace, just absence. In the clearing, the trees were bare, stripped as if by fire. I placed the photographs at the base of a dead oak, the one that had stood beside my tent. Then I whispered for them to rest. At first, nothing happened. Then came the wind, cold and sudden, swirling around me. My flashlight flickered and died. I heard 3 voices in the dark. Thelma, Sarah, Margaret. They weren't crying this time. They were saying thank you, but over their fading words came something else. A deep, guttural sound, like breathing. Heavy, near. The rustling behind me was slow and deliberate. I turned, and between the trees stood the silhouette of a man, tall and wrong, his shoulders bent, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He was watching me. I ran. Branches clawed my jacket, mud sucked at my boots, and the whispers followed, some pleading, some warning. When I finally reached my car, I looked back once. The clearing was glowing faintly, pale light flickering through the fog. 3 figures stood where I'd left the photos. Then they were gone. I never went back. It's been 4 years since that night. The Bureau closed the old cases officially, but new carvings keep appearing at Cathedral Park. Words scratched into the bridge supports, always fresh, always the same. Tell the truth. Sometimes tourists take photos and post them online, calling it urban art. Others swear they hear footsteps echoing on foggy nights or a girl's voice calling from under the bridge. Last month, I received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a new map, hand-drawn. My apartment building marked with an X. There were fingernail marks on the paper. I don't go out after dark anymore. But some nights, when the wind drifts in from the coast, I still hear her voice. He wasn't alone. And I know she's right. Because in the corner of my living room, beside the stack of old case files, there's a faint carving in the plaster wall I swear wasn't there before. TT, she never left. My name is Felix, and what happened to me on the Candor Creek route still haunts every breath I take. I used to drive that road for work, thinking it was just another forgotten stretch of Oregon wilderness. Now, even the thought of it makes my chest tighten. I can't look at any dark forest without feeling like something is watching me back. Back then, I worked as a field technician for a solar equipment company based in Bend. My job was simple: visit remote properties, repair their systems, and make sure everything was running. I spent more time behind the wheel than at home, driving through the valleys and ridges of Central Oregon, where mountains crouched low and the trees whispered even when there was no wind. The Candor Creek route connected two small towns, Marin Falls and Ridgeview, a 21-mile stretch that cut through dense cedar forest with barely any cell signal and no lights after sunset. That night in late October, my last appointment had dragged longer than expected. By the time I packed my tools and started the drive home, the clock on my dash read 7:45 p.m. The sky was heavy with rain clouds, and mist clung low to the ground. I knew that stretch well, but the darkness that night felt unnatural, like something thick had settled over the forest. 5 miles in, the road narrowed, curling between towering fir trees whose branches formed a black tunnel overhead. The headlights barely pushed back the dark, and the sound of rain turned to a steady hiss against the windshield. I turned on the radio to drown the silence. Instead of music, I caught the tail end of some kind of broadcast, an old-time radio jingle for soap powder, followed by a voice reading out war news. I thought maybe I'd hit an AM frequency playing archived recordings. But when I changed the station, the same voice came through, repeating phrases about troops and air raids. Every channel carried that same distorted hum, like the world had rewound 80 years without asking. I shut the radio off and told myself it was just interference from the hills. Then I looked at the clock. It said 9:13 p.m. I blinked, checked again. It had been less than 15 minutes since I'd entered the forest. There was no way I'd lost nearly 2 hours. My phone said the same thing. Both wrong couldn't be coincidence. I slowed at the next turnout, the kind used by log trucks, and stepped out. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. The forest smelled wet and old, the kind of damp that had been there long before people came. I could hear water dripping, but no wind. The silence was so deep it felt alive. I looked up the road, and that's when I saw it, the first light. It hummed in the trees maybe 50 feet ahead, hovering motionless about 5 feet off the ground. It wasn't white or yellow, but a pale bluish green, like the glow of a dying neon bulb. At first, I thought it was someone's lantern, maybe a hiker or a camper lost in the rain. But it didn't sway or flicker. It just hung there, steady and cold. As I watched, another appeared behind it, then another, scattered through the woods on both sides of the road. They looked like orbs, each one about the size of a basketball, and they were completely silent. No shadows, no reflection. The light didn't even touch the wet ground. It just existed in a way that broke all logic. I pulled out my phone to take a photo, but the screen stayed black even though the camera app was open. I tried again. Nothing. I switched to video. The red record light flashed, but the display showed pure darkness. I took 3 steps toward the nearest orb, and my phone powered off on its own. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. Something inside told me to leave. I got back in the car and started driving, forcing myself not to look into the forest. The road twisted sharply, but the orbs followed. Every few turns, one would appear again, always the same distance from me, as if pacing the car through the trees. When I finally broke free of the forest, my clock read 1:12 a.m. The drive should have taken 30 minutes. Somehow, I had lost over 5 hours. I remember pulling over, sitting there shaking, trying to remember anything past that first light. All I could recall was blackness, rain, and a faint humming sound that felt like it came from inside my skull. The next day I went online and searched for anything about strange lights on that road. What I found wasn't comforting. There were stories going back decades, vanished drivers, cars found idling on the shoulder with doors open and engines still running. A woman in 1999 had called the sheriff claiming she'd seen a man standing in the middle of the highway wearing a gray suit soaked in rain. When deputies arrived, her car was empty, headlights still on. She was never found. 2 weeks later, I was called back to Ridgeview for another client emergency. I told myself it was daytime now, nothing could happen. The sky was bright and traffic was light. Everything looked ordinary until I reached the point near Candor Bridge where I'd first seen those lights. Without warning, the radio went silent again. Not static, dead quiet. Then the car began to vibrate, like the engine was struggling. I pulled over, stepped out, and opened the hood. Everything looked fine. No smoke, no smell, nothing. But the air was wrong again. It was cold even though the sun was shining. Then came the sound of footsteps. They were in the trees about 20 feet from the road, slow and deliberate, pacing along the same direction I'd parked. When I stopped, the steps stopped. When I walked toward the trunk, they matched me. I called out, asking if anyone was there, and got nothing back but the faint crunch of wet leaves. I got back in the car, locked the doors, and started driving. The footsteps followed for almost a mile, hidden but keeping pace. Then, like someone had flipped a switch, they vanished. The radio came back to life mid-song. My engine smoothed out. Everything looked normal again. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw those orbs glowing in the forest. I saw shapes moving between them, too tall, too slow to be human. I thought maybe my mind had cracked from exhaustion. But I couldn't shake the detail that all the missing drivers had one thing in common. They disappeared somewhere within the same 7-mile stretch near Candor Bridge. I went back to the route during daylight one final time, determined to prove it was just nerves. I parked near a clearing, walked a bit into the forest, and found something I wish I hadn't. The trees there were scarred, long vertical grooves burned deep into the bark like lightning strikes. Except there was no charring, just smooth, melted wood. And near the base of one trunk lay a seatbelt, cut perfectly clean, ends frayed as if sliced with heat instead of a blade. A week later, a trucker named Brad Keller reported something similar on Highway 97, farther south. He said he'd seen the same hitchhiker 3 times within 20 minutes, each time standing in a different place along the road, always with the same expressionless face and the same torn jacket. He swore it wasn't possible. When the patrol checked later, no one matched the description. Another woman driving near Mount Hebron stopped at a rest area late at night. She claimed she heard tapping on her car roof, rhythmic, slow, matching her heartbeat. When she finally drove off, the sound didn't stop. It echoed inside her car until sunrise. All these stories felt like threads of the same thing, spreading through Oregon's forgotten highways, where the land still remembers what came before us. I quit my job a few months after that. I told my supervisor it was burnout, but truthfully, I was terrified. Every time I thought about another drive, I imagined those orbs waiting behind the trees, humming faintly, ready to pull me back into that stretch of road that eats time. Sometimes I dream of Candor Creek. I see my car on the road, headlights slicing through mist, and something moves between the beams, tall and watching. I wake up before I can see its face, but I always hear that same hollow sound I heard the first night, like something ancient trying to speak through the fog. There are places in Oregon where the world folds in on itself, roads that don't lead anywhere human. If you ever find yourself on one of them and see lights floating through the trees, don't stop. Don't look too long. Keep your eyes on the asphalt and drive. because once it sees you, you don't come back the same. I was never the kind of man who believed in curses, but that was before I went looking for what took my best friend. My name is Mason Price, and what happened on Devil's Backbone Trail still keeps me awake every night. I used to be a wildlife photographer, the kind who chased morning light through misty forests, always searching for beauty where most people saw only wilderness. But 4 years ago, I stopped taking pictures. 4 years ago, my best friend vanished in front of me, and no one, not the police, not the search teams, not even her family, believed what I saw. Samantha and I had been friends since college. She was sharp, warm, stubborn as hell, and always the one who planned our hikes to perfection. She'd check weather forecasts days in advance, pack emergency blankets, and make sure every battery in our flashlights was full. She was the sort of person who never forgot a detail, never took unnecessary risks. And that's why what happened to her doesn't make sense. Not then, not now, not ever. It was late October, the air cold enough to sting our faces. We decided to hike the Devil's Backbone, a trail deep in the Siskiyou Mountains of southern Oregon. It was one of those isolated places most tourists avoided, a twisting path cut into the cliffs with pines leaning out over sheer drops into fog-choked valleys. I'd been there once before for work, shooting a photo essay on autumn landscapes. Samantha had always wanted to go, so we planned a day trip. We started early, just after 7 in the morning, while frost still glittered on the grass beside the road. The trail was empty, our only company, the crunch of gravel under our boots and the slow murmur of the wind moving through the trees. Samantha was in her element, her new camera slung around her neck, snapping pictures of everything from fungi on fallen logs to rays of light breaking through the canopy. Everything felt perfect, peaceful, familiar, until it didn't. By the time we reached the halfway point, the weather had turned strange. It wasn't just fog, it was a heavy rolling mist that moved like something alive, thick and shifting, sliding up the canyon walls and swallowing the sun. The temperature dropped fast, maybe 15 degrees in minutes. I could see my breath hanging in the air. Samantha frowned, zipping up her jacket. This wasn't supposed to happen. The forecast had promised clear skies all day. She checked her phone, no signal. I wasn't surprised. This deep in the mountains, service was a joke. We pressed on anyway. The fog grew so dense it seemed to pulse. Sound changed too. Our voices came back to us in strange echoes, distorted, as though someone else were speaking the same words a few seconds after us. That's when Samantha stopped walking. She tilted her head slightly and said she heard something. I listened but heard nothing except the drip of water from the trees. Then she said it again, more urgent this time. She said someone was calling for help. I thought she was mistaken. Maybe the water or wind had tricked her ears, but her face had gone pale and she turned toward the slope where the trail dropped sharply into darkness. She insisted the voice was coming from down near the creek. I told her we should go back to the car, get help once we had a signal. She nodded as if she'd heard me, but then she started climbing down the slope anyway. I remember the way her boots slipped on the wet leaves, how she caught herself against a tree and kept going, determined, focused. I followed, calling her name, but she was moving fast, too fast. The fog thickened until I could barely see my own hands. I shouted for her to wait. Her voice came back faintly through the mist. I see him, she said. He's hurt. He's lying by the water. I froze. Her words seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing around the ravine. I yelled that I couldn't see her, but she didn't answer. For the next 10 minutes, I stumbled through that fog, slipping on moss-covered stones, tripping over roots, following the sound of the creek. My heart hammered like a drum in my chest. Every time I called her name, my voice came back to me, distorted, drawn out, almost like laughter, and then it went silent. When I finally clawed my way back to the trail, the fog began to clear as suddenly as it had come. Within moments, sunlight poured through the trees again, warm and bright like nothing had happened. The world looked ordinary except for one thing. Samantha was gone. I ran back down the slope, calling her name again and again. I could see the creek now, Every rock, every log, every ripple of water. But there was nothing, no footprints, no gear, no camera. It was as if she had dissolved into the mist. When I reached the parking lot, I called 911. Search and rescue came within hours. Helicopters, dogs, ropes. They searched for weeks. Nothing. Not a single clue. The sheriff pulled me aside on the third day, asked the same question a dozen ways. Was there an argument? Did Samantha run off? Did I hurt her? I told them everything. The fog, the voice, the slope. They exchanged looks like I was crazy. A month later, the official report called it a hiking accident. Probable fall. Body unrecovered. But I know what I saw, and I know what I found later. When I got home, I uploaded the photos from my camera. The last image I took before the fog rolled in showed the creek far below us. And there, standing on the bank, was a man. He was dressed in strange, old-fashioned hiking clothes, wool trousers, leather boots, a pack made of canvas. He looked directly toward the lens. I hadn't seen anyone there when I took the picture. Neither of us had. I zoomed in, and my stomach turned to ice. The face was identical to a missing hiker from the 1980s. His name was Charles Avery. He'd vanished from Devil's Backbone Trail 36 years earlier. I never showed the photo to anyone. But I started digging. I found dozens of similar cases. Experienced hikers, all vanished in the same area. Nearly all reported strange weather, sudden fog, or disembodied voices just before disappearing. There were stories, too. Local legends whispered by old loggers and rangers. They said the valley beneath Devil's Backbone wasn't just deep, it was wrong. A place where compasses spun wild and sound bent in unnatural ways. Some called it the Hollow Turn. Others said it was cursed, that it swallowed the lost. One ranger told a newspaper reporter back in 1973 that he'd once seen someone standing in the fog, waving for help. When he got closer, the person dissolved into thin air. The next day, a woman went missing on the same trail. I stopped going into the woods after that. I tried to move on, tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but sometimes the nightmares come back. I see Samantha walking into that fog, calling my name, fading like smoke, and recently, things have started happening again. 3 months ago, I was driving home from work, late at night. The highway was empty, the forest on both sides, nothing but shadows. Out of nowhere, someone behind me started flashing their high beams, on, off, like they were signaling me to stop. I pulled over, but no car ever passed. When I looked in the mirror, the road behind me was empty. A week later, I passed a broken-down station wagon on the shoulder near Ashland. The engine was still warm, the driver's door open. I was about to stop when I saw tiny footprints, child-sized, leading from the car into the dark brush. I called out, but no one answered. Then, just last night, as I rode my motorcycle along the coastal highway near Florence, my headlight caught something crawling across the road on all fours. It was wearing a torn white shirt and black trousers, business clothes. I slammed the brakes, the bike skidded, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. Every time I see something like that, the fog returns in my memory, thick and cold, carrying that same echo of Samantha's voice. Sometimes I think these things are connected. That maybe whatever lives in that canyon is spreading, looking for others. Maybe it followed me home. I started recording this, hoping that speaking it aloud might make it lose its power. But even now as I talk, I can feel the air around me change, the same pressure drop I felt that day on the trail. The curtains are swaying, though the windows are shut, and beneath the hum of my refrigerator, I swear I hear running water. 2 nights ago, I found a new photo on my phone. It wasn't one I took. It was the same image from that day, Samantha by the creek, but this time she was turned toward me, smiling faintly. Behind her stood another figure, taller, blurred by fog. My phone says the photo was taken at 2:17 a.m. I didn't even touch it at that hour. I think she's still out there. I think they all are. Calling to whoever will listen, whoever will step off the trail and go looking. If you ever find yourself hiking in Oregon and the mist starts to rise, don't stop. Don't listen. No matter how real the voice sounds, No matter how desperate it seems, keep walking. Because some trails don't lead anywhere safe, and some voices belong to those who never left. I had always believed the road to truth was paved with stories, but I never expected mine to end up like this. The night I drove into the mountains near Klamath Falls was supposed to be another simple travel entry, another piece for my blog on forgotten places. Instead, it became the last journey I've ever dared to take alone. My name is George, and I used to be a documentary photographer specializing in America's dying towns. The kind of places where the neon signs flicker even when no one's left to see them, where the wind whistles through hollow motels, and the locals stare like you've woken something best left sleeping. I like that silence, the way it swallowed your thoughts until all you could hear was your own heartbeat. But sometimes, silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it means something is listening. The trip had started as an exploration of old highway legends in southern Oregon. I'd heard rumors of a forgotten diner on the outskirts of a place called Dry Creek, an isolated community that vanished after a series of accidents in the 70s. The locals whispered about strange lights on the mountain, about travelers who went missing after dark, and about a pregnant waitress named Lila Hart, who supposedly vanished during a snowstorm and was never found. They said her ghost still wandered the old highway, looking for the man who left her behind. It sounded like the perfect story. At least that's what I told myself when I packed my camera gear and left Portland just after noon. The sky hung low, a heavy gray that pressed down on the mountains like an old grief that refused to lift. I took Highway 97 south, then turned onto a narrow two-lane road that wound through pine forests and rolling fog. The signs were faded, the asphalt cracked, and every few miles I passed a weather-beaten mile marker leaning slightly in the dirt. That's when I first noticed it. Behind every marker, at least for 10 miles straight, I saw the shape of someone crouching. Just a glimpse at first, a figure low to the ground, head tilted like they were watching me. I told myself it was tricks of the fog, branches bending, or the shifting light, but each time I looked, the silhouette was there, the same size, the same motionless crouch. My pulse quickened, but I didn't stop. I pressed harder on the gas and kept my eyes on the road. By the time I reached the turnoff for Dry Creek, night had started to fall. The sky turned the color of ash, and the first drops of rain hit my windshield. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. My GPS had lost signal 20 miles back, but according to the hand-drawn map I'd found online, the diner should have been just ahead. Sure enough, a weathered sign appeared at the side of the road, half buried in weeds. It read, Hart's Diner, home of the best pies in Oregon. The arrow beneath it pointed up a gravel path that cut through the trees like an old scar. I parked my car beside what used to be the diner's lot, a rectangle of cracked concrete littered with pine needles and rusted soda caps. The building itself stood crooked, one side sagging inward as if the forest had started to eat it alive. The neon letters above the entrance were missing half their tubes, but I could still make out the faint ghost of the word Hearts etched against the wood. It was quiet, too quiet. The air carried that thick smell of wet bark and rust. I could hear the faint buzzing of flies near the back dumpsters, long since empty. I grabbed my flashlight and camera, telling myself this was just another abandoned spot, another forgotten story waiting to be told. Inside, the air was stale. The booths were still lined with cracked red vinyl, menus scattered across the counter like they'd been left in a hurry. Coffee cups sat half-filled with moldy water, plates dusted with years of grime. The smell was a mix of mildew and something faintly sweet, like old perfume clinging to the air. A jukebox stood in the corner, the glass cracked, but the song list still visible, hits from the late 60s. I brushed my hand over the buttons, and one of them clicked under my fingers. The machine crackled to life for a second, emitting a low static hum before dying again. I laughed nervously, though it didn't feel funny. I started snapping photos, documenting every detail: the peeling wallpaper, the ceiling fan frozen mid-spin, the rust-streaked mirror behind the counter. But when I checked my camera screen, I noticed something odd. In every photo, there was a faint distortion near the far booth, a smudge of light, shaped almost like a person sitting there. I wiped the lens, tried another shot, but the figure was still there. That was when the smell of perfume got stronger. It wasn't just faint anymore, it was overwhelming, like someone had just sprayed it next to me. It smelled of lavender and something sour beneath it, like fruit gone bad. I turned, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the room was empty. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in my hand. I walked toward the back hallway, where a sign still hung crookedly above a door, staff only. The door creaked open under my touch, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. My instincts screamed not to go, but curiosity always won with me. That's how I made my living after all, by pushing too far. The basement was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. My flashlight caught rows of old storage shelves, canned goods, and cleaning supplies coated in dust. Then my beam landed on a row of photographs pinned to the wall. They were Polaroids, dozens of them. All of the same woman. She had long black hair, a waitress uniform, and a smile that looked too wide to be real. On the back of one, written in smeared red ink, were the words, "She was waiting." I backed away, my throat dry. That was when I heard the faint sound of crying. Soft, distant, like someone weeping into their hands. It was coming from above me, from the diner floor. I climbed back up slowly, each step creaking under my boots. The crying got louder, echoing through the room. When I reached the top, I saw movement near the window, a figure standing outside in the rain, staring in at me. A woman in a soaked white dress, her hair clinging to her face. She waved both arms frantically, mouthing something I couldn't hear. I started toward the door, thinking she might be hurt, but the second I took a step closer, she stopped waving and smiled. That smile froze me where I stood. It wasn't the kind of smile that meant joy or relief. It was sharp, cold, knowing. She turned and walked backward into the darkness beyond the window until she was gone. I must have stood there for a full minute before I could move again. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know what I'd just seen, but I wanted to get out of there. I packed my camera and hurried outside. The rain had turned to mist, and fog rolled down the hillside, thick enough to blur the road ahead. I started my car, headlights slicing through the white haze, and drove. I told myself I'd upload the photos later, maybe write a short piece about the diner's history, but as I passed the next mile marker, my stomach tightened. There it was again, the same crouched shape behind the post. I gripped the wheel, eyes fixed on the road. Another mile, another crouched shadow. 10 miles, 10 figures. Always the same, always watching, always watching. When I finally reached a rest stop, I pulled over, heart hammering. The building was old but functional, with a single flickering vending machine humming near the entrance. I walked past it toward the restroom, trying to calm down. That's when I noticed it. The machine's digital screen flickered and displayed something that made my blood turn to ice. It showed my name. George, just that. No other message. I stepped closer, and the letters vanished, replaced by the normal, "Select your item" text. I stood there staring, not breathing, until the hum of the fluorescent light above me snapped me out of it. I ran to my car and left. The highway curved along a ridge overlooking the valley. The fog thickened until I could barely see 20 feet ahead. That was when my headlights caught something small on the shoulder. I slowed, frowning. It was a stroller, an old baby stroller sitting alone on the wet asphalt. Inside was a half-empty bottle of baby formula, still warm when I reached out to touch it. That's when I heard the faint sob again. It came from the trees. A woman's voice, broken, pleading. I shined my flashlight toward the sound, but there was only mist and movement, like something slipping between the trunks. I backed away, got in my car, and slammed the door. My breathing came in short, panicked bursts. The radio, which had been silent the whole drive, suddenly came to life with a burst of static. Then a woman's voice spoke through the noise. "Do you remember me, George?" I froze. The voice was soft, trembling, familiar somehow, like someone whispering through time. The static rose again, swallowing the words, then faded into silence. I drove without stopping until the sky began to lighten behind the mountains. The sun broke through in streaks of pale gold, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, killed the engine, and sat there watching the mist burn off the valley below. That's when I saw it. Down by the tree line, near where the road curved into the woods, a faint light flickered. Like a candle in an upstairs window, my stomach turned cold. I lifted my camera and zoomed in. Through the lens, I could see the diner, or what was left of it, and standing in the window was the same woman staring straight at me. I blinked, and she was gone. I checked my photos later that day. In the shot of the diner window, there was indeed a figure, vague, translucent, but there. A woman in a white dress, her hand pressed against the glass, her face pale as moonlight. But when I tried to upload the file, my computer froze and the image corrupted. Every copy I made turned into static. I stopped documenting haunted places after that. I deleted my blog, sold my camera gear, and moved back to the coast. But I still drive sometimes, mostly at night when sleep refuses to come, and every so often, when I pass an old mile marker or a glowing vending machine screen, I catch a reflection that doesn't belong to me. People still talk about the ghost of Lila Hart, the waitress who disappeared one snowy night. They say her spirit haunts the back roads, showing herself to those who carry too much guilt, those who are one decision away from breaking. Some claim she appears to warn travelers. Others say she's searching for her lost child. I don't know which is true. Maybe both. But I know this. On certain foggy nights, if you drive past Dry Creek around 2:17 a.m., you might see a woman in white standing in the rain. She'll wave at you like she needs help, and if you stop, she'll smile. I never believed in curses until that summer near Drift Hollow. There are still nights when I wake up gasping, sure that I can hear someone whispering my name from outside my window. What happened to me and my friends in those woods still clings to me like a shadow I can't wash off. My name is Marwin Finch, and this is the story I've never been able to forget. Back then, I was a junior studying environmental science at a small college near Salem, Oregon. I grew up loving the forest, the kind of kid who spent weekends hiking and pretending to be a wilderness expert. After finals that year, I needed to escape, to breathe something other than library air. My friend Darren had this idea for a camping trip. He said if we wanted to understand Oregon's wild side, we had to go where the map stopped showing names. Darren was the kind of guy who thought danger made everything more real. He found an area called Drift Hollow on an old forestry map, miles of forgotten logging land deep past the Coast Range, reached only by half-collapsed dirt roads and game trails. There were 4 of us that weekend. Darren, his girlfriend Alina, her friend Grace, and me. I was still dating Alina's cousin back then, which was how I'd ended up part of this little crew. We thought we were just going for a few days of campfires, music, and bad jokes about who could last longest without phone service. The drive took hours. By the time we left the paved road, the sun had already dropped low enough to make the sky the color of rust. We passed an old gas station with a sagging sign and a man sitting out front. He looked like he'd been carved from driftwood, thin, gray still. When Darren asked if the road ahead still led to Drift Hollow, the man's eyes shifted to us with something almost like pity. He said we should turn back. He said people who went out there didn't always come back the same. Darren laughed it off, told him we'd be careful. The man didn't laugh. He only said, "Some places remember." Then he looked past us like he was watching something we couldn't see. We should have listened. The road grew narrower the farther we drove until tree branches scraped the roof and the headlights caught nothing but endless trunks. When the engine finally started to overheat, we parked near what looked like an old trailhead. The air was heavy with that wet, earthy scent that only Oregon forests have, something sweet and rotten at once. We hiked for almost 2 hours before we found a small clearing beside a creek. It was perfect in that picture book way. Open enough for tents but ringed by massive cedar and Douglas fir that rose like dark cathedral pillars. We built a fire, set up camp, and cooked the usual half-burned hot dogs. Darren bragged about how no one had probably camped there for decades. Alina played songs on her guitar, soft ones that sounded like they belonged in some other time. Grace told ghost stories she'd read online, her face flickering in the firelight. I remember laughing, though my stomach felt tight. The forest around us was too still. The wind moved above us, but the trees near the ground didn't stir. That first night passed quietly enough until around 2:17 a.m. When I woke to the sound of heavy steps in the dark, they weren't animal sounds. They were too even, too measured, like someone pacing just outside the circle of dead embers. I sat up, listening. Every hair on my arms rose. The steps circled once, twice, then stopped. I thought maybe it was Darren going to relieve himself until I heard his snoring from the next tent. The silence that followed felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then came a noise I'll never forget. It started low, a deep moan rising from somewhere deep in the trees, and then it turned into a wail, long, twisting, almost human, but not quite. The sound hit a pitch that made my teeth ache. It went on for maybe 20 seconds, and then stopped as suddenly as it began. After that, nothing. Not a single insect, not the creek, nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat. Grace whispered from the tent beside mine, asking if anyone else heard it. Darren unzipped his tent, and his face was pale even in the dim light. We sat there for a long time, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't. When dawn came, we all laughed about it, called it an elk, maybe a mountain lion. But the jokes felt hollow. None of us had really slept. The next day we hiked deeper into the woods, pretending we weren't scared. The trees looked older the farther we went, bark blackened by fire, roots twisted like knotted hands. We found scratch marks 10 feet up. One of the trunks, deep, ragged, and fresh. Alina tried to take a picture, but her phone screen flickered and went black. Darren said maybe it was static from the altitude, but we weren't that high. That afternoon, Grace screamed from near the creek. We ran to her and found her staring at the ground. In the mud were footprints, huge, human-shaped, but too long, too wide, with 6 clear toes pressed deep into the soil. They led down into the water and vanished. I crouched to look closer. There were small grooves in the toe marks like the creature had claws. Darren muttered that it must be a bear, but no bear leaves prints like that walking upright in perfect lines. We argued about leaving. Grace wanted to go right then. Alina said we'd come too far to turn back, and Darren called us paranoid. He said the woods were playing tricks on us. I wanted to agree, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was listening. That second night, we all slept in Darren's big tent. The fire outside burned high. None of us wanted to be in total darkness. Around midnight, it started again. Not one voice this time, but several, distant and overlapping, echoing through the trees. Screams, low moans, and strange knocking sounds, like rocks striking wood in a rhythm. At first, they came from far away, but soon they moved closer. The air turned colder. We huddled together. Then something called out from the forest. The voice was broken, deep, dragging across words like it didn't know how to speak. "Come here," it said. "Come play." The tone wasn't threatening at first, more like a child asking for attention, but there was something hollow behind it. Darren grabbed a flashlight and pointed it outside. The beam cut through fog, and for a second, I thought I saw movement, something tall and pale between the trees. When I blinked, it was gone. The voice came again, closer. "Help me," it said. The words sounded almost human but off, like someone mimicking speech after hearing it through water. Alina started crying. Darren whispered that it had to be some kind of prank, maybe locals messing with campers, but deep down, none of us believed that. We stayed like that until dawn. The sound stopped right as the first light touched the treetops. We packed in silence, too scared to eat. The trail back felt longer than before, and the forest seemed to twist around us. Every few minutes, we heard branches snap behind us. Grace swore she saw a figure following through the trees, but when we looked, there was nothing. When we finally reached the car, the windshield was covered in handprints, long fingers, 6 on each, pressed into the dust. Darren touched one and stepped back like it burned him. The prints were fresh, damp around the edges. The drive back was silent. When we reached the highway, I looked into the side mirror and saw a face reflected in the glass, a face behind mine, watching from the back seat. I turned, but no one was there. The reflection stayed for a heartbeat longer before fading away. Back at campus, we tried to pretend it hadn't happened, but the nightmares came fast. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing that same broken voice whispering from my hallway. Gray stopped coming to class. Alina wouldn't answer texts. Darren moved home, said he couldn't sleep without lights on. A week later, I got a voicemail from an unknown number. When I played it, my stomach turned cold. It was the sound of someone humming softly. The melody was one Alina used to play on her guitar. The background noise was faint, but I could hear my own breathing, like it had been recorded inside my apartment while I slept. I called the number back, but it didn't exist. That night, I left all the lights on and watched my reflection in the window. Sometime around 3:22 a.m., a face appeared behind mine again. This time, it smiled. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I turned back, the reflection was still smiling, though my own face wasn't. I slept in my car after that. Darren called 2 days later. He said someone had scratched words into his living room wall during the night. The message said, "You lasted longer than the others." He sent me a picture, and I could tell from his shaking hand that he wasn't faking it. The grooves in the wall were deep, carved by something with claws. After that, we stopped talking. Grace disappeared from social media completely. Alina moved to another state. I transferred colleges. I thought distance would save me, but it followed. I'd see handprints on my car windows, hear knocks on the walls that matched the same rhythm from the forest. One night, I went for a walk near the desert outside Bend, thinking maybe I could finally breathe. The sky was huge and empty. No trees, no fog. I felt safe for the first time in months. But then I heard it again, faint and distant. The same distorted voice carried on the wind. "Come play." I turned toward the sound, and there was nothing but open land. Yet the air felt thick, like the forest had stretched itself across the miles just to reach me. I ran home and locked every door. Still, I could feel it waiting, patient, just outside what light could reach. Now years have passed. I live far from Oregon, in a place where the desert swallows sound. People tell me to let it go, that it was trauma, that the mind makes monsters out of guilt. Maybe they're right. But every so often, I'll catch a reflection in the window that doesn't match my movements. Or I'll hear that voice again, soft, broken, just outside the edge of sleep, calling my name. When I close my eyes, I'm back in Drift Hollow, the fire dying, the trees leaning close, and the world holding its breath for something ancient to speak. I was 24 when I first understood that some places never stop remembering. 2 years out of college, broke, and too proud to move back home, I took a job at a forgotten little place called the Avalon Cinema in the coastal town of Newport, Oregon. The theater sat near the edge of the cliffs, its cracked neon sign flickering over the empty street like a pulse that refused to die. I didn't know then that the building was alive in its own way, breathing through its walls, whispering through the reels of film it still kept in its basement. My name is Talon Reddick, and for nearly 9 months, I worked there as a night custodian and projection hand. My degree was in digital media, but the job posting mentioned old film handling experience preferred, and that was enough for me. I'd always loved the smell of celluloid, the warmth of the projector, the hum before a film began. I thought I was stepping into nostalgia. What I stepped into was memory, not mine, not the town's, but the theater's. On my first day, my supervisor, a thin, tired man named Walter, gave me a tour. He moved slow, his hand always brushing the wall as if reassuring the building that we meant no harm. The Avalon had opened in the early 1920s as a seaside opera house, and later, when the town modernized, it became a cinema. The place still held on to its Art Deco bones. Sweeping arches, patterned ceilings, and thick velvet curtains faded to rust. Walter said it was temperamental, that the sea air got into everything, but his voice lowered when he spoke about the upstairs storage room. "Don't stay up there after closing," he warned, not quite looking at me. "The sound carries weird." I didn't think much of it then, but the first night I closed alone, I learned what he meant. Around 11:45 p.m., when the last of the patrons had shuffled out into the fog, I went upstairs to sweep the hallway. The walls were painted sea green, peeling in long, curling strips. As I moved the broom, I heard footsteps, heavy ones, pacing behind the old concession stand that hadn't been used in years. I thought it might be Walter, but when I called out, the steps stopped. Then, softly, they began again, moving from one end of the hall to the other, measured and slow, as if someone were walking through an old routine. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. Always around midnight, always the same path. I asked Walter if anyone had ever stayed in the building after hours. He just shook his head and said, "The Avalon remembers everything, even what it shouldn't." I laughed, thinking it was one of those small-town ghost stories meant to keep new hires from quitting too early, but a week later, I stopped laughing. There was a little maintenance closet beside the upstairs projection booth. The door was always stiff, and when I forced it open one evening, a thin, leather-bound notebook slipped out from the top shelf. It landed at my feet with a dull thud. Inside, every page was filled in the same neat handwriting. Dates, times, and short, mundane entries. Swept the lobby, checked the reels, cleaned the lens. It was a projectionist journal, but the last entry froze me. June 14th. Heard the applause again, checked upstairs. He was in the seat this time. That was it. No signature, no name, just that. I checked the cover, a faint embossed initial FC barely visible in the corner. That night, I couldn't stop imagining who he was. The next few weeks blurred together. My shifts started at 7 and ended past midnight. Walter rarely stayed past 10, leaving me the keys and a quiet good luck. The Avalon's silence after closing felt too deep, like the soundproofing between worlds had worn thin. Sometimes, I would hear what sounded like faint humming through the vents. Other times, the film reels in the storage case would shift by themselves, their metal edges scraping faintly in the dark. Then came the glove. It was red, old-fashioned, made of fine leather. I found it lying beside the main stage one night while mopping. Thinking someone had dropped it during a show, I tossed it in the lost and found. The next evening, it was sitting on the counter near the projection booth. I laughed uneasily, carried it back down, and threw it away. The following morning, it was back, this time draped neatly over the seat where I usually sat to take my break. I stopped touching it after that. 2 months in, I began hearing the footsteps again, but now they came from beneath me, the basement. The Avalon's basement was narrow, filled with the smell of mold and sea brine. I avoided it as much as possible, but the breakers were down there, and sometimes the power flickered. One night, around 12:32 a.m., the lights went out mid-cleaning. I took my flashlight and went down. The air was heavy, the smell of wet plaster stronger than ever. Halfway down the steps, I heard breathing. Not just faint, loud, ragged breathing right under the stairs. I froze. My light shook against the wall. The sound stopped, then resumed, slower this time, like whoever it was trying to stay quiet. I backed up slowly, heart hammering, until I reached the door and locked it behind me. The next morning, I checked the security footage, but the basement camera had gone static at exactly 12:32 a.m. Still, curiosity pulled at me. A few nights later, I placed my phone under the basement stairs, recording before I left for home. The next day, I played it back. For nearly 3 minutes, it was silent except for the hum of the building. Then came the breathing, clear, close, human. After that, a voice, low and trembling. You shouldn't have found the book. The phone dropped from my hand. I listened again, certain I had misheard, but the words were there, unmistakable. I wanted to quit. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I needed the money, and part of me, the same reckless part that had made me take the job in the first place, wanted to understand. I started researching the Avalon. Old records from the Newport Library showed that the theater had closed briefly in the 1930s after the original owner, Frederick Corman, was found dead in the basement. Official cause: electrocution while repairing wiring. But the paper mentioned something odd. Witnesses claimed to have heard applause in the empty auditorium that night, long after the power had gone out. The initials in the journal, FC. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every creak, every shadow, every temperature drop began to feel like someone trying to communicate. I began talking back. When the projector jammed, I apologized aloud and the reel would start again as if nothing had happened. When I heard the footsteps, I'd say I knew they were there and that I meant no harm. Then came the night everything changed. It was mid-October, close to Halloween, a storm rolling in from the sea. The theater was nearly empty, only 6 people in the audience for an old horror marathon. Wind rattled the stained glass windows, and rain drummed on the roof like restless fingers. Around 10:46 p.m., the power flickered. I rushed to the projection booth, cursing the storm. As I adjusted the film reel, I felt something behind me, a cold pressure, like someone standing just out of reach. The reflection in the projector glass showed a shape, a man in a dark suit, face pale, watching the screen. I turned, and the air grew colder. The reel jammed, film ripping through the spool. I heard the faintest sound, slow, rhythmic clapping from the auditorium below. When the lights came back, the audience was gone, every single seat empty. The red glove was on the projection table. I called out for Walter, but he hadn't come in that night. The only other sound was the distant crash of waves. My chest tightened. I ran downstairs and saw something I will never forget. Every seat in the front row was filled, not with people but with shadows, faint and flickering, like the ghosts of burned film frames. They were watching the blank screen, heads tilted, completely still. The sound of applause rose again, steady, measured, as if for a performance long ended. Then they vanished, leaving behind the scent of sea salt and old smoke. I quit the next morning, left my key on the counter, and didn't look back. But I couldn't shake it. Weeks later, in my new apartment, I began finding that red glove again. On my desk, in my car, once even inside the freezer. No matter where I threw it away, it came back. The dream started soon after. The sound of applause, the feeling of someone standing at my shoulder, the echo of breathing beneath my bed. Last week, I moved my bed to check, half laughing at myself for being paranoid. There was nothing there, except a small, dusty notebook wedged under the floorboard. The cover was damp, the pages sticking together. My name was written inside the front cover in the same neat handwriting I'd seen before. Talon Reddick, January through September. Every page after that was filled with logs of my routines, down to the minute. What time I arrived, when I swept the lobby, when I left for home, all of it accurate. All of it ending with tonight's date. The last entry reads, "He will hear the applause again at 2:17 a.m. I'm writing this because I can already hear it starting outside my window. Soft at first, but growing louder, spreading through the night air like the tide coming in. If you ever visit Newport and you see the old Avalon sign still flickering through the fog, don't go inside. Don't even stop to look. Because the theater doesn't just remember those who died there, it remembers those who loved it, who tried to keep its stories alive. And now, I think, it remembers me too. I never believed the dead could linger until I walked into the house on Riverbend Road. I thought ghosts were stories told to scare kids, not something that could reach out and touch your life forever. My name is Miles Keaton, and what happened to me near the old Hemlock Dairy outside Brimwell, Oregon, still follows me into every quiet night. I used to make a living as a home insurance field agent, the kind of guy who took photos of damaged barns and filled out reports about storm losses or property claims. It was simple, honest work. Most of the time, it meant walking through empty houses with flashlights and measuring tape, sending paperwork to people I would never meet again. But that autumn job was different. That job turned everything I knew about the living and the dead into a lie I could never take back. It was late September when I got the call from Margaret Downs, an older woman who had inherited the old Hemlock Dairy from her uncle. She told me she wanted to sell the land before winter, but needed a full inspection for insurance and development purposes. She mentioned vandalism and strange lights, things she thought were caused by bored teenagers, but her tone carried something else beneath it, a fear she didn't want to admit. The neighbors claimed they saw people walking near the barn at night, though no one had lived there in almost 50 years. That morning I drove out from Brimwell before sunrise. The sky was pale gray, the kind that seems to drink all color from the world. The gravel road wound through fog-covered pine groves, every bend revealing more emptiness. The air smelled of rain and cold earth. When I reached the gate, it was hanging crooked on one hinge, rusted and twisted, as if something had pushed through instead of opening it. The hemlock dairy sat low against the hillside. The farmhouse was 2 stories with chipped white paint and sagging eaves, the kind of place that looked tired from standing so long against Oregon's endless wet seasons. There was a barn behind it, an old silo, and a row of sheds with collapsed roofs. Blackberry vines had taken over the fences, swallowing everything in green thorns. At first, it seemed like any other abandoned property: rotted wood, broken windows, years of decay. But small things began to bother me the moment I stepped out of my truck. The windows on the front of the house were broken from the inside, the glass glittering on the porch instead of on the floorboards. The door was open just a crack, swinging gently even though the air was still. In the soft dirt near the porch, I saw footprints, tiny ones, like a child's bare feet, pressed in neat patterns around the foundation. I crouched down and took pictures. The prints went in deliberate lines, not random paths. They led toward the side yard, to where an old garden once stood. I expected weeds and broken fence posts, but instead I found order. Someone had been taking care of the soil. Rows of green sprouted through the dirt: squash vines, potatoes, herbs. Fresh tool marks cut through the ground. The tools themselves were lying beside the fence, cleaned and stacked neatly. They were iron, the kind forged long before my grandfather's time. I brushed a finger against one handle and felt the dry smoothness of wood that should have turned to dust decades ago. I walked back to the house, trying to shake off the unease. The boards on the porch groaned under my boots as I pushed the front door open. The smell hit me first, not rot or mildew like I expected, but the faint scent of soap and something floral, like lilacs. Inside, the air was still. Dust hung in the sunlight like tiny silver motes. Every piece of furniture was covered in a thin sheet of cloth, yet the kitchen looked lived in. There were flowers on the table, fresh ones, wild daisies in a mason jar filled with clean water. On the counter sat a loaf of bread, sliced cleanly, not moldy or stale. I turned toward the pantry and saw canned food stacked in rows, all new labels, all modern dates. The refrigerator door was slightly open, and though there was no hum of power, when I touched a jar inside, it was cool, almost cold. That was when I heard it. Voices. Soft, low conversation coming from somewhere upstairs. It was like the sound of a family talking over breakfast, the tone casual, calm. I could hear a man's voice, a woman's, and the faint laughter of children. I froze, my camera still in hand. I called out, saying who I was, that I was there for the inspection. The voices stopped instantly. A few seconds later, the sound of movement, slow, careful footsteps, drifted across the ceiling. The staircase creaked as I climbed, one slow step after another. The air grew colder the higher I went, until I could see my breath fog in front of me. The hallway stretched out, lined with framed photos, smiling faces from another century. At the end was the master bedroom. The door was open. The bed looked like someone had just climbed out of it. Sheets rumpled, pillows sunken, a coffee cup half full on the nightstand. Steam rose faintly from the cup. I reached for it, my hand trembling. The ceramic was warm. I looked around, heart pounding, but there was no one in sight. I searched every room. Children's toys sat scattered across the floor, marbles, wooden blocks, a doll missing one eye. On a small desk, a school book lay open to a half-finished page of handwriting. The letters were neat, looping, still fresh enough that the pencil marks hadn't faded. A dress hung on the back of a door, the fabric soft and smelling faintly of lavender. I went back downstairs, confused, telling myself it had to be squatters. But when I checked the utility poles outside, there were no wires connected to the house. The power lines ended half a mile down the road. The well pump was rusted shut. There shouldn't have been water, electricity, or heat. I decided to wait. I sat in my truck with my camera ready and watched the house. The fog rolled down the hills as the sun began to set. Then I saw them. They came out from the back door, 4 figures, a man, a woman, and 2 children. They walked into the garden, carrying baskets. They looked solid from a distance, real, but something about the way they moved made my skin crawl. Their motions were too smooth, too quiet. The man reached down to pull weeds, his hand passing through a stalk without bending it. The children played with a small dog that wasn't there. The woman knelt to harvest squash, her hair moving like smoke. None of them cast shadows. I lifted my camera and snapped a series of shots. When I looked at the screen, every photo showed only the garden, no people. The family stayed until dusk. Then, as the light faded, they began to walk back toward the farmhouse. The closer they got, the more transparent they became. By the time they reached the porch, they were gone. I sat there until my headlights were the only light left. Then I drove back to Brimwell, unable to stop shaking. That night, in my small apartment, I heard laughter in the vents, children's laughter. My building didn't have any kids. The sound went on for hours, echoing softly, almost playful, until around 2:17 a.m. when it stopped. The next morning, I started researching the Hemlock Dairy. The property had belonged to the Yarrow family, Harold and Ruth, and their children, Caleb and Anna. According to county records, they vanished in 1936. Their disappearance was written off as a family abandoning the property during the Depression, unable to pay taxes. But the more I dug, the stranger it got. Old newspaper articles hinted at a feud between Harold Yarrow and a neighbor named Frank Vellum, a wealthy rancher who wanted the dairy land for himself. One article mentioned a police report. Harold had claimed Vellum threatened him and his family after he refused to sell. 2 weeks later, the Yarrows were gone. 10 years later, construction workers found 4 bodies during a well excavation on Vellum's property. The county coroner ruled them as Native American remains and reburied them without further testing. But the report matched the Yarrows' descriptions exactly. I wrote all of this in my report to Margaret Downs, but left out the part about what I saw. I focused on the evidence of murder, the missing family, and the likelihood of unmarked graves on the land. I told her to contact the sheriff's office before she tried to sell. A week passed. Then Margaret called me again, her voice shaking. She said the police had found bones, 4 sets, buried near the edge of the field behind the barn. They matched the size and age of 2 adults and 2 children. Forensic testing later confirmed their identities: Harold, Ruth, Caleb, and Anna Yarrow. Frank Vellum had died in 1952. He was never charged. The sheriff reopened the case for the record, but there was no one left to punish. I went to the memorial when they reburied the Yarrows in the Brimwell Cemetery. The sky was gray again, the same heavy color as that first morning I drove to the farm. As the pastor spoke, I felt something like relief and sorrow twist together in my chest. That night when I came home, I found my living room furniture moved into perfect shapes. The couch, the table, the chairs, all aligned in geometric patterns I couldn't understand. My phone buzzed with no number, just static. From the kitchen, faintly, I heard the sound of a door creaking open. Behind my washing machine, a small wooden panel was visible that hadn't been there before. Its edges were worn smooth, as if touched often. Fresh fingerprints lined the frame. I stood there, frozen, listening. From inside the wall came the same children's laughter I'd heard before, muffled and distant, like echoes traveling through time. I moved out 2 days later. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the vents of any place I live, I hear soft voices again, whispering about fields and harvests, about home. I tell myself they're just memories, but deep down I know the truth. The Yarrows aren't bound to the land anymore. They're bound to the person who finally listened. If you ever step onto a piece of Oregon soil that feels colder than the rest, or see lights in windows that shouldn't have any power, don't assume the ghosts mean to scare you. Sometimes they're trying to finish what was stolen from them, to tell their story before silence swallows them forever. Because the dead remember, and sometimes they remember you. I remember the way the fog moved that night, like it had a heartbeat. I'd been told Oregon's coast could be strange after dark, but I didn't come for the scenery. I came for my sister. Her name was Lila. She'd gone missing somewhere near a half-buried town called Pine Haven, a place that didn't appear on modern maps anymore. The sheriff said she probably fell, that the sea took her. But I knew better. Lila was a marine biologist. Careful, calculating. She'd been researching a series of disappearances along the cliffs. Fishermen, hikers, even a Coast Guard volunteer who'd stopped answering his radio mid-sentence. I told her to stay away from Pine Haven. She laughed. That was 7 weeks ago. They found her truck near the base of a fog-drenched road that curved toward the abandoned wharf, the keys still in the ignition. No footprints. No sign of struggle. Just a door hanging open like someone had left in a hurry or been pulled out. So I came here, to the edge of the Pacific, to the cliffs that swallowed light. The air smelled like rust and seaweed, and every gust of wind sounded like something whispering my name. I'm not brave. I'm a history teacher from Salem, used to quiet classrooms and coffee stains. But sleep stopped coming. Every dream led me back here to the cliffs, to the sound of her voice beneath the tide. The drive took me through dying coastal towns, past shuttered bait shops and fog-sick motels. The last real stop was a gas station near Rock Hollow. The old man behind the counter refused to look at me when I asked about Pine Haven. He just shook his head and muttered, "Some places wash back what you leave there." I reached the turnoff near midnight. The road dissolved into gravel, then into something older, mud and crushed shells. My phone flickered between one bar and none. The forest loomed, dense and soundless except for the occasional drip of condensation falling from the pines. Lila's last message burned in my mind. Follow the coast 3 miles past Breaker's Point. Look for the red buoy. Found something unbelievable. I found the buoy. Or what was left of it. It was lodged in a dead tree, half a mile inland. Beyond it stood an archway of stone, eaten away by moss and time. A rusted plaque leaned against one of the pillars. Welcome to Pine Haven, Est, 1903. Population smeared away. The town didn't look abandoned. It looked restrained, like something had wrapped invisible fingers around it and told it not to breathe. I started with the main street, boarded windows, peeling signs, a toy store with its door half open, the air inside thick with mold. The toys were lying neatly on the shelves, untouched by time. A doll with one eye stared at me from a counter, her porcelain face cracked but her lips still red. In the post office, a stack of letters sat behind the counter, yellowed but sealed. One envelope caught my eye, addressed in fresh ink to a family that, according to the dates on the other envelopes, had died in 1974. The name read, "To the Whitlocks, all of you." I didn't open it. Something in the ink shimmered faintly under my flashlight, like it was still drying. I pressed on. The air grew colder the deeper I walked into Pine Haven. My breath fogged, even though the night wasn't that cold. Then I saw her reflection in a broken window. Not Lila, someone else. A teenage girl, pale, wearing a school uniform soaked from the mist. She stood outside a general store, staring at the locked door. I blinked. She didn't move. She didn't move. Just stared. When I turned my light toward her, she was gone. Every building leaned toward the sea as though drawn to it. The last one standing straight was an old clinic on the far end of town. The sign above the door read, "Dr. Vayner's Community Health Center." The handle turned too easily. Inside, the smell hit me first. Salt, metal, and something sickly sweet. The waiting room was frozen in time. Magazines from the 70s. A tipped-over chair. The reception window cracked but intact. Behind the counter, I found ledgers stacked in perfect rows, bound tightly in leather. The top one was stamped Tidewater Health and Research Division. I opened it, expecting patient names. Instead, there were case numbers and deductions. Margins scribbled in red. Subject drowned intentionally for reanimation study. Controlled suffocation. Failed. Family compensated with fabricated documentation. My hands shook as I turned each page. It wasn't a clinic, it was an experiment site. The last entry was dated June 14, 1983, the day Pine Haven burned, according to the old newspapers I'd read. A low creak echoed through the hall behind me. I froze. My flashlight beam wavered. There was movement upstairs, soft, dragging, like someone walking barefoot across wet wood. I called out, but my voice sounded small against the walls. No response. The office floorboards looked newer near the back. I knelt and brushed away dust until my fingers struck metal. A hatch. I pulled it open and felt a breath of cold air rise from below. The ladder groaned under me as I climbed down into the dark. At first, I thought it was just a basement. Then I saw the gurneys, rows of them. Some with restraints, some with dried stains too dark to identify. Cabinets lined the walls filled with syringes, scalpels, and glass jars floating with things that might once have been human. A light flickered deeper inside, a string of solar lamps strung haphazardly along the ceiling. They led to a steel door. On it was a note, written in smudged ink, "Do not enter when they whisper." I opened it anyway. The chamber inside was lined with Polaroids. Hundreds of faces, men, women, children. Their eyes wide, mouths open as if caught mid-scream. In the center of the room, on a table covered in surgical sheets, was a body. My breath stopped. It was Lila. Or what was left of her. Her skin was gray, her lips sewn shut. A file lay beside her. Subject 28B. Vocal cords preserved. Oceanic adaptation, incomplete. Something clicked behind me, like a camera shutter. I turned fast. No one. But when I looked back at the wall, there was a new Polaroid pinned among the others. Me. My face frozen mid-turn. I dropped the flashlight. The beam spun across the floor, catching movement. A shadow sliding along the wall, though nothing stood between me and the light. I ran. Up the ladder, out the door. The fog had thickened to a wall. Every direction looked the same. When I tried to retrace my steps, the street bent where it shouldn't. A sound followed me. Footsteps. Slow. Wet. I called out, but the echo came back wrong. Too close. Too identical. Somehow, I found the schoolhouse near the edge of town. The bell tower was half gone, but the structure stood firm. I ducked inside. The air felt scorched. The walls blackened. But the desks were still arranged neatly, each one holding a melted candle. On the chalkboard, faint but legible, were the words, "Today we return to the tide." The teacher's desk held a journal. Its pages warped from water but readable. Locked doors at 10:45. Begin submersion process. No survivors. No witnesses. A whisper rippled through the room, light as foam but cold as the sea itself. The sound of children laughing drifted from somewhere behind the walls. I turned and saw wet footprints appearing one by one across the floorboards toward me. Then they stopped. The silence that followed pressed against my chest like pressure under deep water. I backed out into the fog. My phone was dead. My watch had stopped. The forest surrounding Pine Haven looked wrong, trees leaning in strange directions, the ground uneven as if breathing. Every path I took looped back to the same crossroads near the buoy. The signposts turned themselves. The air hummed faintly, like the sea beneath the earth. I wasn't alone anymore. I heard someone walking behind me. Slow, steady, rhythmic. When I spun around, I saw a man. Or what used to be one. His face was pale, hair dripping as though he'd just climbed out of the ocean. His clothes clung to him, shredded by salt. He smiled. It wasn't kind. "You found her," he said. His voice was wrong, like two people speaking at once, one calm, one desperate. His eyes rolled white, then black. I stumbled backward and fell, scraping my hands on gravel. When I looked up, he was gone. Only water pooled where he'd stood, seeping into the ground like veins. I kept walking. I don't remember how long. Hours, maybe. The fog had weight now, pressing down like wet cloth. Every so often, I saw that same teenage girl standing in the distance, always facing me, always unmoving. At one point, I reached a boarded house near the shoreline. Its door creaked open on its own. Inside was a narrow hallway and the faint scent of sea brine. I was too tired to resist curiosity. As I stepped in, I heard someone pacing above me. Slow steps, back and forth. But there was no second floor. A voice whispered through the vents, familiar, trembling. "Lila's. Don't breathe it in." The walls began to weep, trickles of salt water leaking through cracks. I stumbled outside, gasping, and realized I'd come full circle to the clinic again. The door stood wide open, as if waiting. I don't know what made me go back in. Maybe it was madness. Maybe the mountain air. Maybe I couldn't leave without answers. I found the tunnel again and followed it deeper this time, past the Polaroids, past the examination rooms. The air grew warmer, metallic. A faint hum pulsed beneath my feet. Then I saw it, a second chamber. The walls pulsed faintly with light, like veins under skin, and in the center, lying strapped to a gurney, was Lila. Her chest rose and fell. She was alive. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, but something was wrong. They weren't her eyes anymore, too dark, too deep. She smiled. Her voice came out calm, detached. "You shouldn't have come." Behind me, the door sealed shut with a hiss. I banged on it, but it wouldn't move. Lila sat up, unfastening the straps with a strength that didn't belong to her. The lights flickered. The hum grew louder. "You hear them, don't you?" she said. "They never left. They just changed shape." I backed into the wall. The hum became voices, hundreds of them whispering at once. A language that felt older than the tide. Lila tilted her head. Her smile widened unnaturally. "You came to feed it," she said. "Now you belong to the current." The world tilted. The floor opened beneath me. Cold water surged up from the dark, swallowing the chamber. I screamed as it dragged me down. Salt burned my throat. The last thing I saw before darkness took me was her face, bending, twisting, breaking apart into something vast and wrong. When I woke, I was on the beach, morning. The sea calm, my clothes soaked. My car parked where I'd left it, though I didn't remember driving back. In the sand beside me, a Polaroid fluttered in the wind. My face, my eyes open, my mouth stitched shut. I drove until the fog disappeared in my rearview mirror. I told myself I'd never go back, but every night since I've heard it, the faint hum under the floorboards, the crash of invisible waves against the walls. And sometimes, just before dawn, I see her reflection in the window, smiling. If anyone finds this journal, don't look for Pine Haven. Don't follow the coast. Don't answer the whispers that sound like your own voice. Some towns don't die. They wait.